Hispanic Heritage Month wraps up today. Illinois State Comptroller Susana Mendoza honored 3 Hispanic Illinoisans for their contributions to the state. One of them is from Macomb. Illinois Capitol Bureau Chief Max Cotton has more from today's ceremony in Springfield.
Thanks a lot.
Hector Maime Surgañez is the Dean of Libraries and General Studies at Western Illinois University in Macomb. Tuesday, Illinois State Comptroller Susana Mendoza honored his contributions to his community as part of Hispanic Heritage Month.
It's a great recognition from the State Comptroller, and it's not only about me, it's about the people that we are trying to make a difference in higher education, and also to bring kids from K to 12 to start thinking that university is a good path to do a better life for them.
He says as part of his responsibilities, he works closely with Dreamers and other students of color, not just as an academic leader, but as a role model, one of many across the state, including Mendoza, Illinois' first and only statewide individually elected Latina.
We are everywhere, and we are really adding to the value of what our neighbors and neighborhoods are like, right? We are part of the community.
Data from the 2020 census shows about 18% of Illinoisans are Hispanic or Latino, which is more than 2 million people across the state.
When people talk about Latino communities, people think about big cities, but that's not anymore reality. We have small towns like Beerstown, that there are right now 50% of Latinos over there.
It's a hardworking, committed community who just wants to be a good neighbor. They want to set good examples, and I think that we can point to any community across Illinois and find people who are just setting the bar for great civic leadership and being good neighbors.
In Springfield, Max Cotton, WGEM News.